We're talking about virtualization, following up on the VMware story from last week and taking a look at how you virtualize apps in the cloud. Next on Cloud Chronicle. Hi, I'm Andy McCaskey from SDR News. And as I mentioned, we're talking virtualization along with the host of the show, Patrick Pushor.
Hi, Andy. How are you?
Doing well, Patrick. And we've had a good chance to talk a little bit before we jump into the show. And one of the things that was kind of a recurring theme was this discussion of VMware and how they are establishing things in the cloud world, but maybe stepping on a few toes as they move in.
Yeah, that's right. Last week we talked about how it's becoming difficult maybe for them to compete in a really super innovative, fast-paced, let's call it cloud operating system kind of world, right? Where we've got OpenStack and we've got many of the other competitors against this incumbent of VMware. Probably on the heels of that, it makes sense to talk about VMware's move into a service provider position. And I think that's what you're referring to when we talk about the potential stepping on toes, right? So we've got VMware moving into being a public cloud service provider after they've gone ahead and chosen and worked very closely with partners to stand up their vCloud stack themselves as service providers. We're talking about companies like Terramark and Savvis and partners like that. So there is a bit of tension there, I think, in the VMware partner ecosystem, at least on that side of the fence. I think on the traditional side, everything's probably fine, but I think where you incent and support your partner community to go out and build public cloud offerings based on your stack, and then go ahead and do the very same thing yourself. I think there's some maybe partner and VMware distrust there, and time will tell how that kind of works itself out, but. I think one of the challenges, maybe one of the reasons VMware did that, is they saw some real lackluster acceptance of the vCloud Director stack as a public cloud powering technology. And, that's probably the biggest story in all this, really.
So did you feel that they just were not getting traction from a competitive standpoint? Was that the primary issue?
Yeah, I don't know if they're not getting traction or not getting enough traction. Maybe they expected traction like they have on the private cloud or just the straight virtualization traditional areas there. And of course, we know they are massive on just straight virtualization. Every enterprise has some amount of VMware inside it, right? So maybe their expectations were that the public cloud would be that, not easy, but that would be more straightforward to sort of saturate. And we're definitely not seeing that. And I think that probably speaks to the buzz around OpenStack, the fact that it's maturing very quickly. We talked last week about their 3-year kind of birthday or anniversary of the project and just how far it's come in 3 years. I mean, it's amazing. So, I mean, there's lots of really, quite frankly, less expensive, maybe more feature-rich platforms out there, right? So it's really no surprise, at least to me, that VMware is struggling a bit on the service provider side. But maybe they felt, given their stronghold on the enterprise virtualization kind of angle, that this would be a little easier than it is.
Where do you think it would be perhaps a good match? What type of organization might want to look into this more closely?
That's a great question. I think maybe previously I would have said a company that maybe isn't building applications specifically for the cloud. Maybe at this stage they're only looking at kind of virtualizing what they currently have and kind of offering that to the organization as a service catalog kind of basis. Maybe they would be fine with a vCloud powered solution. But even there, I think it might be a bit irresponsible to suggest that, simply because I think most of us see the future of the public cloud as a place where you'll develop apps specifically for it, apps that know how to scale themselves, or talk to kind of a meta controller, can scale horizontally. Today there's not a lot of enterprise apps that do that, but to suggest standing up a private cloud based on technology that isn't probably super well suited for that may not be the best advice, simply because, in 5 or 10 years, that may be exactly where everybody is. So, I think a more traditional cloud based on existing applications, VMware does a perfectly fine job. But as we think about kind of the new horizon of apps being purpose-built for the cloud, that's where maybe some of the competition does better. And quite frankly, I hope and I think that's where a lot of organizations, even who only develop a little bit of software themselves to be able to move the business forward, they aren't necessarily software developing shops. I still think they're going to get to the point where either themselves or partners will help them get to that place where they purpose build apps for the cloud. But so it's hard to really recommend maybe vCloud for most situations, but maybe the super traditional organization is one that could entertain it.
Right. Well, and of course, you spoke about folks in the OpenStack community, and then you have Microsoft, you've got AWS. What about niche players that are focused on performance? It sounds like this wouldn't be a particularly good match there either.
Yeah, if you're focused on performance, so if you're serving a niche, and we know a few cloud providers that do this with things like great storage I/O. Maybe they've got some flash technology behind their cloud stack, and maybe some quality of service built in as well. Yeah, I don't think they're going to need a platform that's very open and customizable as well. And that's of course another one of the great advantages of the open source, not just OpenStack but Cloud Stack as well. You can get under the covers, you can build modules, you can interface very simply because all of that, of course, is open source. And if you've got the expertise in your team, that's all fairly readily available and sort of interfaceable. Whereas you look at vCloud, it's more of a black box. Wait for VMware to build connectors or get involved on that side and build them themselves. But it's a much more formal process when software is kind of black box versus when it's open source. So even there, I'm not sure that a niche player's choice would be clearly VMware.
Yeah. Well, moving on to our next story, which we actually got from the folks at One Cloud Road, where they were talking about how to virtualize business critical applications. And I think you very quickly zeroed in on one aspect that you think maybe needs a little more emphasis as you're considering this.
Yeah, definitely. So you're right. We were perusing stories or things that we thought were interesting to talk about. And if you head over to One Cloud Road, they have one called The Secret to Success When Virtualizing Business Critical Apps. One Cloud Road's a great site. They hit the nail on the head on most things there for sure. I kind of thought about maybe what we talk about as a continuation, not just virtualizing, but maybe cloud onboarding. Because of course, virtualizing and cloud aren't the same thing. They're kind of virtualization in my eyes is a stepping stone or a foundation for cloud, but it's certainly not all encompassing. So when we think about virtualizing these workloads, it can be a bit of a challenge. Things like heavy disk I/O, database applications, right? So in the article on One Cloud Road, they mentioned we've come a long way in terms of technology boundaries or objections, and I think they're right. The one that might remain is storage, and when you add this notion of multi-tenancy in terms of the public cloud, it becomes an even bigger deal. So I think there are some, we've talked about niche solutions in our last story. There's a good opportunity for, I think, niche players to come up, and some are already doing this, come up with a way to address that particular problem. And I think two of the ways that I see that being done today are specific technology to support better throughput on storage I/O, and whether that's like a flash as primary storage kind of solution from a vendor like SolidFire, for example. I think that's one of the ways they solve that problem, or they aim to. The other is a quality of service layer, and again, I point to SolidFire because that was inherent in their solution right from day one. Where, for example, we all know in a multi-tenant environment, performance is less predictable than it is within your traditional data center when you're the only tenant. So one of the things you can do there is you can say, me as party A and you, Andy, as party B, if I pay extra, I can get kind of an increased quality of service for my heavy database I/O applications, for example. So it's almost different tiers of service for your needs, and of course having the right hardware in the back to be able to guarantee that service that I'm purchasing. That's one way to do it. When I attended an Amazon event before they were doing their yearly summits. I guess they've done one of those. There's going to be another one in November. I attended one on the West Coast, I think in San Francisco 2 or 3 years ago. And the biggest objection there, the biggest, what do you still need out of Amazon kind of question was storage I/O. So, places like SmugMug, who build their business on top of EC2 and S3, really look for better performance when they're doing their transcoding of video, when they're doing their real-time kind of either filters or conversions of formats. They need some really heavy disk I/O to be able to do that. Compute's fine. They've built their solution out to scale horizontally, but the disk I/O is really kind of the biggest demand. So I think that's probably a problem that's well on its way to being solved. I would say that's probably the biggest challenge, I think, when we talk about business critical apps and their fit onto the cloud.
What about the situation where you're engineering a private cloud on the resources that you control? It sounds like you would still have these same issues as far as just making sure that that your storage capacity will be available at the density that you need.
Certainly, I don't want to make it seem like it's a total concern on the public cloud and a non-issue on the private. It's not quite that black and white. But when you're the only tenant, at least your organization is, you may have different organizational units, and you'll need some visibility into who's doing what at one time. But I'm not sure you need quite the same features as you would in a storage array on the public side to manage that massive multi-tenancy than you would on the private side. You would still need a really great disk array. You might be able to get away with flash as a caching tier rather than primary storage there, right? And with some fancy kind of visibility into what workloads are being done at what time, and being able to schedule maybe heavy disk IO bound ones at different times. Of course, when we get into a multi-tenant environment in the public cloud, you don't have the visibility of what other tenants are doing, right? So you have a lot more options on the private side. Certainly the technology that's available to public cloud providers is available to you on the private side too. If you want to go out and get a SolidFire like disk array, you certainly can. But may not be needed. With the additional visibility you have into the environment on the private cloud side, you might be able to get away with some other less expensive solutions, maybe even some procedural kind of stuff.
But then not only focusing on the speed of the storage, but also the interconnections, the buses that connect the two.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, quite often what we see when people stand up a private cloud, let's call it proof of concept, is they do that with spare hardware. They do it with networking gear or capacity that they already have set aside for a project like this. And before you know it, people really enjoy it, and it starts getting depended on. And here you've got a situation where you really only right-size the environment for the POC, but all of a sudden, because the quality of the solution, right out of the gate, it starts getting depended on. And now you're in this position where you have to sort of reverse engineer things while people are depending on the technology, and that can be a real challenge too. But yeah, you've got lots of choices on the private cloud side, right? You can run sort of iSCSI, you can dedicate some fiber, you can either build a very inexpensive disk array for sort of pilot or POC purposes, or you can go full out and carve some capacity off of your big disk array that already serves the organization. Lots and lots of choices there.
Well, all set so you don't become a victim of your own success.
Yes.
In fact, you're a bit of a victim of your own success as well. I understand that next week you're heading up to Redmond. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so with AppZero, we're taking a trip to Microsoft to educate a little bit around our solution, and I'm sure there'll be some education in the other direction too. I'll get to learn a little bit more about Azure and sort of the strategy there. So hopefully lots to talk about next week coming out of Microsoft, and of course we'll have our regular peek at the cloud news next week too, and incorporate as much as we can.
Okay, well, Patrick, as always, great to talk with you, and thanks to you folks for joining us here today on Cloud Chronicle.